be here in the Jubilee Centre again, and I got slightly arm-twisted into this by Jonathan Tame, my friend and colleague, because I said, So I said in the end, he really wanted me to do it, and I wasn't so keen. I said, if I can find the lecture I gave last time in 1991, I'll come and do it. And I managed to find my notes from 1991. Here they are. So I had to do a little refreshment, of course. But it's important that you understand that, well, last time I remember giving this talk, Elizabeth Catherwood had just given a lecture to the Cambridge History Society, and I just wanted you all to know that this is not Michael Schluter giving a lecture to the Cambridge History Society. This is a local Christian reflecting on a most eminent 19th century reformer and thinking a little bit about what we learn from him about social reform that might be useful for us today. Now, given the fact that I believe that one of the great mistakes that evangelicals are making is to concentrate on previous reformers and think that we're simply going to reproduce what they did, so this huge emphasis, for example, on Wilberforce, I think is wonderful at one level because he's a most inspirational figure, as Shaftesbury is, but can be mistaken if we think that we're going to do something very similar to him, because the world, frankly, has moved on. We're in a much more global situation now in terms of the way laws are made and society is framed and changes happen. And I think it's dangerous if we get locked into a mindset that says what we're going to do is replicate something that someone has done in the past. So I think this story of Shaftesbury that I'm going to tell you this evening is highly inspirational. I found it wonderful going back into his life again. But at the same time, I don't think that what we will be doing will be quite the same as what he did, nor will we be using quite the same techniques that he did. However, having said that, there's still a lot to learn from him, obviously. And the presentation inevitably is selective because he was a man who I think had influenced about 197 organisations by the time he died. They all turned up at Westminster Abbey for the funeral, as well as having immense influence within the political framework and within the Church of England as well. So he just had his fingers in so many pies that, you know, one loses count. So I'd like to talk first a little bit about, in a rather simplistic way perhaps, about how I see where he fits in the sort of history of Christian social reform, just looking very quickly at the broader context in which he was operating. Then I'd like to think about his personal background and faith, then look at his social reform programme, then look at his religious views and involvement quite briefly, and then think about his family and personal struggles, and then think at the end about, well, what do we learn from this that's useful for us if we're going to engage in changing society in some way, and then I hope get some feedback from all of you. So probe where you like. I may or may not be able to answer the questions you come up with, but perhaps among the group of you here there'll be some additional sources of information. So in terms of the wider historical context, I tread here again with trepidation. The way that I've sort of seen it in my rather simple way is that you have this, you have the Reformation, and then you have, through the Puritan movement, you have this astonishing amount of social change that takes place under the great Puritan reformers, and in particular I'm interested in Oliver Cromwell. He was, of course, a Cambridge man himself, and I think had an immense long-term influence on this country. I regard him almost as the greatest of the social reformers in a sense, although he was quite cautious about how radical he was prepared to be. But after he dies, and you have Charles II coming to the throne, there's a great sort of wet blanket that comes down on sort of evangelical Christianity anyway, and from about 1660, he dies in 1658, through to about 1740 when Wesley and Whitfield start to operate out of Oxford, there is a sort of almost a spiritual dark age that happens. It's again an oversimplification, but It seems that the morality governing the country sort of goes down a steady sort of nosedive direction. You have a wealthy elite who don't seem to care very much for the poor, and yeah, it's a rather depressing period, I think, from a Christian point of view. And then you have this remarkable resurgence with Wesley and Whitefield, who seem to come out of nowhere. Obviously, one believes that the huge amount of prayer that followed the death of Cromwell and the end of Puritanism, the 5 Mile Act, when the ministers were not allowed to go within 5 miles of their congregation, so they travelled around the country and they spent an enormous amount of time in prayer. We're talking 1660 to 1680. I believe the prayers of that faithful generation, in a sense, got answered with the revivals under Wesley and Whitefield. So you get this huge growth of faith, of moral commitment, of tackling a lot of the evil abuses in the 18th century coming under those two. And on the end of that, you get the Clapham sect and you get Wilberforce coming, sort of 1785. This is obviously hugely oversimplified, but you see where I'm going. And after 20 years of campaigning with that whole group in the Clapham sect and Wilberforce providing some leadership, Hannah More, there was just a lot of them involved in that campaign. In 1807, you get the abolition of the slave trade. And another nearly 20 years on, 1833, under Buxton and people, you get the abolition of slavery itself. So in that period, the focus still seems to be around tackling slavery. And if you're interested in social reform, one of the strangest things, I think, about the whole Wilberforce episode was that they chose a foreign policy issue, something which virtually no English people had really had much personal contact with. If you didn't live in Bristol or Liverpool, how many people had ever seen a slave? Well, virtually nobody would have seen a black person if they lived in East Anglia or the South East, because it just wasn't part of daily life. So, but the principles that underlay the abolition of the slave trade, about the basic humanity of each person and how valuable they were in the sight of God, didn't seem to flow over into what was going on in early industrial Britain. So what was going on in the coal mines and the early manufacturing industries and so on, where you had the most appalling degradation, as I shall read you a couple of excerpts to give you a kind of flavour of that, did not seem to come up in people's minds, even though they had worked on the abolition of slavery and the value of every person. Why there wasn't that carryover is not clear to me. One day if I have some time to do some historical research, it would be really fun to look into it. The big struggle with France that had gone on and bedeviled a lot of Wilberforce's work in the very beginning of the 19th century was now over. We'd had the Battle of, Battle of Trafalgar and then the Battle of Waterloo, and Britain's hegemony had been kind of established both in Europe and globally to a very substantial degree. So we're now in a period when Britain had this extraordinary power globally, and what it did with its own, the way it organised its own society, how it dealt with its own poor, was bound to influence many other countries as well. So it's into that situation that we find Lord Ashley. Anthony Ashley was his name before he acceded to his father's title, Earl of Shaftesbury, when he was about 50. So he was Lord Ashley until he was 50, and then he became the Earl of Shaftesbury when he was 51, when his father died, and that caused endless and amusing confusion. So you get people writing, I don't know if I can find this quote, can I find it? Probably not. If I find it later, I'll read it to you. But you get this confusion where people are writing and saying, well, what's this Shaftesbury guy got to do with it? He wasn't around when Lord Ashley was abolishing or setting up the 10 Hours Act for the factories. And, where was he when the struggle to set up the schools was involved? And, people just don't realise it's all the same person. So moving on from there to his personal background, he was born in 1801 in his uncle's house in London, named Anthony Ashley Cooper, and He had a very hard life at home. It was often cold, he writes. He wasn't fed properly. His parents seemed to be rather uncaring. His father was not widely respected and was very little known really in public life. But the good news was he had one very important friend. Between the years of 0 and 10, there was a housekeeper called Anna Maria Miller, generally referred to as Maria. And she spent her time telling Ashley Bible stories. And she told him about the love of Christ. And she loved Ashley a great deal when no one else seemed to. And she had an immense influence on this young man's life. When Maria died, he was about 10. But I think that she did bring him to a living faith in Christ. It's hard to be certain exactly when he crossed over that line. When he was about 25 or 26, he seems to have had a fresh religious experience at that time. But the influence of this humble woman who was the housekeeper seems to have been immense. And I think it's an encouragement for us to reflect on that. In human terms, imagine what she achieved for God through her faithful prayer and ministry to one small boy. How little often we respect people who don't have high profile but who are working behind the scenes, and we are very poor, I think, at gauging who is really important in spreading the kingdom of God or fulfilling Christ's ministry on earth. So from his first school he goes on to Harrow. He was never happy at school, but he did reasonably well. He left early, probably because his parents were short of cash. When the Earl of Shaftesbury eventually died, he leaves enormous debts behind. And again, it's a characteristic I note, thinking about social reformers that I've looked at, like Wilberforce and Shaftesbury and so on, that most of them start very rich and end very poor. And it's just a characteristic of their lives. And at 18, he went up to Christ Church, Oxford. He did an honours degree in Greek and Latin, i.e. classics. At the end of 3 years, he got a first-class honours degree. That was in 1822. And I think it follows from that he was no fool. Anyone who gets a first-class honours degree at Oxford is probably no fool, but sitting here in Cambridge, of course, I'm not bound to say that, am I? He then goes 3 years travelling. So he goes to Switzerland, Naples, Rome, Vienna, all over Europe. He has a brief love affair. He seems to be rather far from the Lord at that point in his life. But from 1825, he's back in England, and he begins to seriously study to deepen his faith. So what exactly grips him at that time to decide he needs to understand his faith better is not clear, but something drove him. What's often not known about him, because he is known widely as having been a person who gets very depressed, and he did get very depressed in his life a lot, is that he also had a great sense of humour. And a man called Grenville writes after his death, "I've hardly ever known any man with a greater sense of humour or with a greater appreciation of humour in other persons." So there is this curious balance between his own slightly depressive character and this sense of humour which comes out from time to time. And in 1826 he becomes an MP in the unreformed House of Commons. Now 1826, think you're very close towards the end of Wilberforce's life. Wilberforce dies in 1833, about 3 days after the abolition of slavery. So 7 years before he dies, up comes a new young MP, aged about 25 at the time, he at that time takes on the biggest project of his life probably, which is the reform of the Factory Act, which is all to do with how long children can work in mines and in manufacturing industry and so on. I'm going to come to that in a moment. But just focusing on his personal life for a moment longer, we move on to 1829 when he's 28 years old, and he falls in love with a young woman who's just 18 at the time called Lady Emily Cooper, Cowper rather, Lady Emily Cowper, popularly known as Minnie. Minnie seems to have been extraordinarily popular. She rejected 4 suitors already by that time, one of whom became a future Prime Minister. And it seems that Ashley had the advantage of always being very good looking, and after a rather protracted period of wooing, he succeeds in getting her to the altar, and they marry in June 1830. And they have a very long and enormously happy relationship together. They are very close, and she has 9 children by him, and I put down a quote from page 42 of this is John Pollock's biography, which just describes her as a mother more than anything else. Minnie's heart had been open from the first, and she was soon, in Ashley's words, long after, a sincere, sunny and gentle follower of our Lord, quotes, without losing her naturalness and high spirits. Their home reflected her sunny nature. She could laugh at herself and at him. I don't know how it is, she wrote, I not only love you, but when you're away, I hate everybody else. Their first child, Anthony, was born on the 27th of June 1831. However many they might have, Ashley was determined to make their childhood as happy as his own had been miserable. Minnie could not have made a child unhappy had she tried, in Pollock's assessment, and she does seem to have been a very happy sort of character. But their marriage had important political implications, because Minnie's uncle was William Lamb, who became Lord Melbourne and was Prime Minister in 1834, and again from 1835 to 1841. So there was one strong connection to a Prime Minister there. Minnie's stepfather was Lord Palmerston, who of course was also Home Secretary and then Prime Minister. And he was always extremely fond of her and extremely friendly to Ashley, and he kept getting roped into cabinet positions and things like that because of these connections, particularly as he became popular with the masses because of his social work. So he did benefit enormously from his background as the child of the Earl of Shaftesbury, the position that gave him, the big estates down in the southwest of England, but also from the person he married. There is also enormous pressure on him to join the cabinet. And in 1852, when the Prime Minister was going through a very difficult time, I think it's Palmerston at that point, he's under enormous pressure to join the cabinet. The Queen wants him, and Prince Albert wants him, and this would shore up the political party and the rest of it, but he doesn't want to go back into politics. By then he's come out of politics for various reasons, and he doesn't want to go back because he wants to do his philanthropic work. He desperately needs the money. Minnie wants him to have the money because he's got no income, and he never seems to have any income, and he survives by the skin of his teeth all the time, and in the end 4 evangelical friends give him an enormous loan because he's got no money, which I don't think they ever get back, but probably they didn't expect to. But he doesn't in the end take the position, and he's able to get on with his philanthropic work. So let's think about his social reform issue for a moment. There are 4 major issues I'll touch on briefly. The first is the care for the mentally ill, what were called lunatics in those days. The conditions were quite rough, so I'm reading here from Richard Turnbull's biography of Wilberforce, of Shaftesbury. So there was a report written, I'm just looking for the date of it, 1827. So this is the one of the first 2 issues he takes up. The report dealt with the aims of these institutions where, quotes, lunatics were kept. The dispenser of drugs for the parish of Marylebone was William Gouger, and his responsibility was to attend to the pauper lunatics. And he commented in his evidence, quotes, I do not think that it is the chief aim of the institution to attend to the mental disease. Patients with varying degrees of severity of illness were confined together in a small space. Some were chained. Patients were left entirely to their own devices, as there was no attempt to provide employment of any sort. Other witnesses, including former inmates, also provided additional evidence of the most horrific conditions. One described 170 men sharing one towel for a week. Another former patient, John Nettle, described being chained naked on a bed of straw in a crib without any utensils for eating, and seeing other cribs infested with maggots, and inmates not even let loose to relieve themselves. Treatment was clearly not part of the purposes of these institutions. Containment appeared the main motivation. They also had this rather nasty habit of washing them in freezing water in the winter. It was all part of a process of keeping them down, keeping them submissive, keeping them under control, containing them. So the horrors of these lunatic asylums were horrendous, and he becomes a commissioner of the Metropolitan Commissioners in London. After a year he was made chairman, and he held that position, wait for it, he held that position for 57 years. This was a guy who really stuck at it in the projects that he undertook over long, long periods of time. Let me move on to the Factory Acts. The issue here, so he led then an act which was called it was the Lunatic Commission. It was followed by, I think, the Lunacy Act. In 1845 they finally passed the Lunacy Act, which is described as a landmark in the history of mental health provision. And yeah, it was just a long, long campaign. And not many people wanted to be associated with it, not many people, as it were, there wasn't much glory in being involved in trying to resolve the problems of people with mental illness then, any more than there is today. It's probably the least popular political issue to get associated with. With the Factory Acts, you have a much more evocative clientele, in the sense that you've got all of these children working down the mines and in the factories. So you have children of 5 years old and upwards, working usually for 12 hours a day. A child of 5 working for 12 hours a day, it's almost unthinkable, isn't it? For 6 days a week. Sometimes they even worked for 14 or 16 hours. Sometimes they worked all night. Often they had to clean the machinery during the meal breaks. Accidents were frequent because the children got tired. Often it was extremely hot in the mines, and also extremely wet. And in those wet, extremely hot conditions, often the men would work naked because it was so hot, and the women would be semi-naked. But in that situation there was a huge amount of TB. So it was just horrendous conditions, and they were kept under control with whips. Again, there are a couple of interesting descriptions in Turnbull, which I will read to you because I think it's important to understand what was happening. If the coal seams were thin, then the roadways would be small and cramped. The height of these roads were only 24 or 30 inches high, making the employment of children indispensable. And even then, they were often only on their hands and knees. There was also evidence of the failure to ventilate the mines properly, which led to loss of life through the gases which remained in the mine. In some instances, drainage was so poor that miners had to work all day long in drenched clothes. One commissioner reported, "I've met with pits where it rained so as to wet the children to the skin in a few minutes, and at the same time so hot they could scarcely bear their clothes on to work in. And in this wet state they had to continue 14 hours, and perhaps had to walk a mile or two at night without changing or drying their clothes." Or, "When the nature of this horrible labour is taken into consideration, its extreme severity, its regular duration of 12 to 14 hours daily, which once a week at least is extended through the whole of the night, the damp, heated and unwholesome atmosphere in which the work is carried on, the tender age and sex of the workers, a picture is presented of deadly physical oppression and systematic slavery, of which I conscientiously believe no one unacquainted with such facts would credit the existence in the British dominions." And on it goes. There's just quote after quote of this awful situation. So some people in the north of England, where these factories and mines were located, started what they called the 10 Hours Movement. And the person who was their spokesman in the Commons, a man called Mr. Sadler, William Sadler, I think, lost his seat in the 1832 election. And the leader of this 10 Hours Movement, a man called Mr. Bull, came to London looking for someone to lead the issue in the Commons. He tried everybody. The last person he tried before giving up was Ashley. When everyone else had refused, and Ashley only had 24 hours to make up his mind. And the choice was a difficult one for him because it would mean the loss of a lot of politically powerful friends. Because most of the people who were in the Commons, who were politically powerful, were part of the manufacturing or mining industries and therefore had a vested interest in the status quo. So there seemed to be very little in the way of possible gains from getting involved. No gains politically, personally, or financially. So why did he accept to take it on? And I think the only reason one can really give is that it was the call of God. He studied his Bible, he prayed, and he had 24 hours to make a decision, but he decided he would take it on. And once he'd taken it on, he stayed with it again for years. And the main reform of the Factories Act, which happened, I think, eventually in 1844, that's 12 years later. You had an initial reform in 1834, but you had the main reform in 1844, another 10 years later, was due to this long-term campaign to get things changed. I was quite interested as I was reading. This was, I think I got this from Pollock rather than Turnbull. Those are the main two sources I've looked at for this. But I was quite interested in the range of arguments that were used in leading up to the 1844 Act as to why the status quo should be maintained. Just see what you think about these arguments. Number one, the employer and employee must be free agents. The government should stay out of it and not get involved with legislative intervention, the sort of nanny state argument. They focused, those who wanted the status quo to remain, focused on the good factory owners and claimed that they were typical. So there was an evidence question. Factory legislation would harm workers' self-reliance. It would make them dependent on the state. Or fourthly, reform would make Britain uncompetitive in world markets because it would raise the cost of labour. Or fifthly, it was not the best or most effective way to help the poor. Much better to focus on repealing the Corn Laws and make food cheaper than to play around with conditions in the manufacturing industries. At one point, Peel argued that it was not the right time to do it. The country was in a recession, so you can't do this kind of reform in a recession. There was a personal attack on Ashley himself. He's a foreigner, that means he's from the south. He's a foreigner interfering in the North's internal affairs, so he should stay out of it. Another argument was that if you reduce the hours of children, it would tend to a necessary reduction in adult hours, which would be unfair to the adults who wanted to work those long hours. And there were a lot of disputes about statistics. How many miles does a child walk each day when minding the machines? Is it 20 miles a day, or is it only 16 miles a day? So you can see the kinds of arguments that are used. And as we have a very experienced politician sitting here, I'm sure that he would be familiar with the fact that the House of Commons still plays around with
nothing changes much.
Arguments of that kind. Sticking to the law that had been passed and stopping finding their ways around it and using the courts to do that. And Ashley got an enormous amount of mud slung at him for that, because they said that he'd compromised, he'd given way on the principle of the issue and everything else. But he stuck to his guns, and 2 or 3 years later, when he went up to the north, he was greeted as a huge hero because now the act was being implemented, and although it was 10.5 hours a day for 6 days a week, it still meant a very radical improvement in the conditions of both adults and children. Briefly on the other issues, let me just to give you a sort of sense of the range of things he dealt with. the conditions in the lead mines in 1842, the ragged schools. These were schools for people in low-income areas, low-income children who couldn't get to school in any other way. He answered an advertisement in the Times and became chairman of the Ragged Schools Union and was chairman for many, many years. He brought in the Chimney Sweeps Bill in 1834. He lost a bill to prevent Sunday work in the post office. He only won it for 3 weeks and then it got changed. But the wealthy wanted their post on Sundays, and have it they did. He started a thing called the Labourers' Friendly Society for people who were seeking housing when they went to look for work in London. He started training ships for the Navy for young urchins on the street around East London, child emigration schemes. He was on the board of health for London for 6 years and ran the board single-handed for a week during a cholera epidemic. He tried to reform burial schemes. He also tried to reform the London water supply scheme. So he failed on the burial schemes and failed on the London water supply, but because he realized how important water was for the poor. But what he did to campaign on those issues eventually resulted in those issues getting taken up and changed. But he didn't win everything he turned his hand to. He campaigned on this enormous range of things. Then there was the safety of public shipping. He brought in the Plimsoll line. He campaigned for agricultural workers. He formed the Shoe Blacks Brigade after the Great Exhibition. He was interested in costermongers' welfare. I'm trying to remember what costermongers do. Michael, can you help me with costermongers? No. Medical, education of women, the stirring up of opposition to slavery. As I say, 197 missions, schools, hospitals and societies in which he'd been involved sent representatives to his funeral. So he made a crucial contribution to the work of many, many other people. So here's a man who lived an extremely hectic life, never let the grass grow under his feet, constantly starting new things. I mean, talk about social entrepreneur. I mean, I think I've done quite a lot in starting about 10 organizations. This guy seems to have started literally about 100. But he gave up his leisure time to pursue help for the poor and vulnerable. And this impact of his work was not just in London, but all over the country. I think one of the things that strikes me most about him is that he was willing to give up his time on such an extraordinary scale. I mean, he could have lived a very comfortable life, thank you, if he'd wanted to. But he chose not to. He had no idea about money. He never managed to sort out his financial affairs. So he did end up with a lot of debt and a lot of financial problems, but he could obviously have spent less time working and more time just relaxing and enjoying himself. He also put together a very key point, which is that living conditions have a big effect on morality. So you couldn't preach chastity to boys and girls when they're living in overcrowded cottages and forced to sleep side by side in one room. You'd got to do something about the housing. And I think that was a very important insight, and I'll reflect on that at the end briefly. Just quickly on then his Christian views. Very strongly committed to the Bible, so he was chairman of CMS, chairman of the Bible Society in Britain after it was started around 1850, and he reacted very negatively against liberal scholarship, which was beginning to gain ground. This was not so much an intellectual response, but simply because he'd had a powerful experience of the Bible in his own daily life. Very committed to personal Bible reading and prayer, committed to the whole Bible, horrified at the suggestion that the Gospels were more inspired than the Book of Chronicles. And extremely opposed to the High Church movement, the Puseyites in Oxford. Can't remember what his first name was. Is it Anthony Pusey? Was his cousin. Edward Pusey, known as, was his cousin. And later he was very opposed to the Oxford movement, or the Anglo-Catholic movement as it became. But he did write and apologise to Edward Pusey, his cousin, for some of the things he'd said, and they became firm friends, and at least at that personal level, things got sorted out relationally. He was a strong millennialist. He'd learnt this from an Anglican vicar, Edward Bickersteth. What drove him was not so much a care for people's bodies as a concern for their souls. So he wanted to make a difference to their physical situation, but he believed that more important even than that was whether they were going to heaven or to hell. And whether that was, quotes, lunatics or factory children or chimney sweeps, he believed they all needed to be saved. They needed proper living and working conditions if they were going to hear and respond to the gospel. So he also had a strong view on prophecy. He persuaded the Prime Minister to appoint the first Bishop of Jerusalem. He was pro-Zionist. He believes that the Jews should return to Palestine. And on Christianity and science, he was totally unthreatened by scientific discoveries and believed that when science advanced far enough, it would vindicate the biblical record completely. So he also, because of his connections with the prime ministers, had an enormously important role in the appointment of bishops. So many evangelical bishops in the Church of England owed their position to his influence with the prime minister. On the family side, he had 9 children, but it was really a tale of tragedy. Francis died of pleurisy when he was at Harrow School. It happened very quickly, over 2 weeks. He was a child with strong faith. Maurice was an epileptic and died aged 20 in Lausanne, where he'd gone for treatment. His daughter Mary died of asthma. His daughter Conti died of TB. His eldest son had serious debts as a consequence of his style of life. He married Harriet, who for many years was hostile to her husband, but perhaps it wasn't entirely her fault, I think. And his wife died 14 years before he did, and he never really got over the loss of Minnie, and worried a great deal about the question as to whether he would ever see her again as he had known and loved her on earth. Would she be special anymore to him or him to her? And he was looked after by one of his last children, Hilda, in his old age. So he had these 9 children with an enormously mixed experience, but he absolutely adored these children. I mean, he was not like Wilberforce in that sense, who, I think Wilberforce did enjoy children, but was a little distant from them, but Ashley seemed to be very much engaged with them. 1 or 2 final observations then. So, at a policy level, thinking about how this applies today, and from my own experience of doing some social campaigning through my life, I think the importance of the arguments comes through very strongly, particularly with the work on, quotes, lunacy and the work on the Factories Acts. And I think also I'm struck by the fact that these huge social issues were right under the noses of many committed Christian people, and yet they never saw it. And I find myself wondering what a future generation will think when they look back on our generation now and say, well, why on earth couldn't they see that? If you take this connection between the physical conditions that people have and their morality, just think about the link between debt and divorce. So we all get this incredible amount of advertising thrown at us through letters, through the media and everything else. I'm very struck by an advertisement from 118 on the ITV, which advertises consumer credit. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, it says average APR 99%. That means you borrow 1,000 and within 12 months you've got to pay back 2,000. And ITV are happy to promote this on the screen. So The link between debt and divorce is well established. Debt and wife battering, child abuse, all of these things we studied in the Jubilee Centre back in 1991. I got copies of the report, Families in Debt, where we looked at 1,000 cases of people with multiple debts, and we studied in depth 50 particular families where we wanted to see the social impact. It's also in the peer-reviewed literature out there. We can't say we don't know. The population of Japan today is around 126 million. I think actually it may have come down a little bit, maybe now 120 million. By the year 2200, at current rates of the fall of population and assuming some growth in longevity, the population of Japan will be 7 million. From 120 million to 7 million. In Hong Kong, which I'm visiting again in 2 weeks' time, you have probably the lowest birth rate in the world. It's 0.9 children per adult woman, and it means that 30 to 30, well, it's actually 35% of the workforce. They'll have a 35% smaller workforce than they have today in 30 years from now. Now, obviously, they will probably bring in people from mainland China to make that up, so you may say, well, does it really matter? But it's the same in Singapore. There just is this catastrophic decline in population going on in much of Asia. And although the Chinese government is now allowing people to have more than one child, it's still a major problem because people are not sure if they want more than one child now. So why is this happening? And I think it's largely happening because of the hours of work that people are required to do. So look at the hours of work in Singapore and Hong Kong and in Japan, and it's around 70 hours a week. But if you've got 70 hours a week and you're adding on to that a 1 to 2 hour commute each way to the office every day, you just don't have time to form the relationships that are necessary to marry. So the marriage rate is falling catastrophically. Even if you do get married, you haven't got time to have children because they take a lot of time. So people are just not having children, and the birth rates are just falling. And every prime minister, every political leader, they tend to be in power for 5 or 7 years, thinks, well, we're not going to really see the full impact of this on my watch, so why do I need to worry about it? Now, of course, it's very serious in Germany as well. So Germany has also got a population problem on a pretty big scale. So I think they are about at the level of 1.4 children per adult woman. So they're losing maybe 30% of their workforce every 35 to 40 years. It's that kind of amount. So you then get a little bit cynical about, Angela Merkel welcoming in these Syrians, because actually she's got to find some replacement to her falling workforce. I mean, Germany's got a serious problem on its hands. So I think there are problems under our noses that need to be addressed, and I wonder whether the word slavery is too strong a word when I look at, for example, in Japan, how workers are treated, how much they're expected to stay, for example, to entertain the manager after 11 o'clock at night, or whenever they finish work, they're still expected to go out to dinner and entertain the manager, and then they get some hours of sleep, and then they've got to be back at work in the morning. Lord Shaftesbury was very committed to the Bible as the basis for public policy, and he gives his own private view in 1825. Just quote that to you because it's an interesting quote, I think, for the Jubilee Centre. He says, in his diary he writes, "I have a great mind to found a policy upon the Bible, indeed one based upon justice and active benevolence." So he had no big vision of what society should be like. He was pragmatic, as you saw from the 10.5 hours bill change, but he was quite pragmatic in saying, look, there's this social evil, let's tackle it. There's this one, let's tackle it. There's this one, let's tackle it. It goes on and on and on, tackling more and more and more. But the cumulative effect of this was enormous, and he's widely credited with being a key factor in the fact that There were not Chartist riots at around 1848 when there were revolutions across Europe. So you can look at him and you can say he had a very privileged birth. He had enormous natural gifts. He was a great speaker, orator, able to really enthuse a crowd. He had these enormously powerful connections with Prince Albert, great friend of Prince Albert, with Wellington, Palmerston, Melbourne, prime ministers here and there. I mean, he had these connections at high levels in society. He had a wonderfully happy home life with his wife, although he'd had a difficult relationship with his father. On the other hand, you could say, well, many of his children died. Each one was a great personal loss. He had all the financial costs of campaigning on these issues where there was no personal gain. He gave up high office in the cabinet. He was often depressed. So you have this sort of balance of somebody with these enormous gifts and opportunities, and yet at the same time a person who struggled in a number of areas personally. If you think about an overall assessment of the man, you have to say that perhaps the most significant thing about him is that he made Christianity credible in the general population, because he stood so strongly for his Christian faith. And when the general population thought about Christianity, they thought about Wilberforce, and then they thought about Shaftesbury, and they thought, this is real, this is something worth having in society, this is something we want. Now, after Shaftesbury, you get about 100 years, I think, until about 1970, when the church is remarkably disengaged from social engagement. It's hard to point to any major social movement coming out of the Christian community between 1870 and 1970. Really, there's just not much there. It really starts to decline sharply after about 1900, but there's still momentum between 1870 and 1900 from the things started before.
What are the reasons, do you think?
I'll come back to that if I may in a moment. I'm just going to finish this point. So I think one of the most encouraging things to me about what's happening in the church is the re-engagement with the social side. So we have Christians Against Poverty, and very large numbers of people now getting debt counselling. We have the food banks, which were started by the church. People know they were started by the church. You have, obviously, the continuing work of the Salvation Army, but you also have a lot of Christian social activities starting to take place just since about 1970. And I think that does provide credibility to the gospel. And I think Jesus makes that point. I'm going to finish with this verse. In Matthew 5, a passage you all know well, where he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men." This is the NIV translation. So what we've seen is the gospel getting thrown out and trampled on, in my generation anyway, because of this absence of engagement in the wider society. Jesus goes on, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." So I'm stopping there. Thank you.